Hey everybody, it's Ed. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know about an exciting event I'll be moderating in Bozeman, Montana next Thursday, May 16th. It's a free screening of a fascinating new short film called Good Fire, Bad Fire, Inside the Race to Restore America's Forests. The film captures the breathtaking beauty of our nation's forest and delves into the urgent crisis threatening their existence. The film explores healthy forest ecology and the history of forest management, from Native Americans to Smokey Bear and beyond. Through expert insights and stories from the front lines, it illustrates how the size and intensity of today's wildfires are directly tied to the health of our forests and how we can manage them. With 80 million acres of forest and countless communities at risk, Good Fire, Bad Fire is a rallying cry to rapidly accelerate restoration efforts before it's too late. And after the film, I'll be moderating a discussion with an all-star group of panelists, including hunting and conservation legend Randy Newberg, the U.S. Forest Service's Brian Farabee, CEO of PERC and past podcast guest Brian Yablonsky, and more. I can promise you that it'll be a fun and educational discussion. The event will take place at Bozeman's Museum of the Rockies, and it starts at 6 p.m. Again, the event is free, but you need to RSVP, which you can do through the link in the episode notes. Space is very limited, so reserve your spot sooner rather than later. Can't wait to see some of you there. This is the Mountain Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is Hampton Sides. Hampton is a Santa Fe-based historian and best-selling author who's written many books that are favorites of Mountain Prairie listeners, including Blood and Thunder, On Desperate Ground, and Ghost Soldiers. His newest book is titled The Wide, Wide Sea, Imperial Ambition, First Contact, and the Fateful Final Voyage of Captain James Cook, which is available now and sitting high on the New York Times bestseller list. If you're a longtime Mountain Prairie listener, then I'm sure you're glad to see that Hampton has joined me for yet another podcast conversation. Much of Captain Cook's epic third voyage takes place far from the mountains and prairies of the American West, in tropical paradises including Tahiti and Hawaii. But what you may not realize is that a big portion of his final voyage was spent exploring and mapping the west coast of North America, from the rocky shores of present-day Oregon and Washington all the way up to Alaska. While I was somewhat familiar with Cook and his explorations, I didn't fully understand or appreciate the mind-blowing scale of his journeys or his impact on world history. As is the case with all of Hampton's books, he melds together deep and extensive research with thrilling storytelling to make the process of understanding history as entertaining as it is educational. While Cook is obviously a central figure in the Wide, Wide Sea, the book also profiles numerous fascinating Polynesian and indigenous historical figures, including the Polynesian man named Mai, whom Hampton and I discussed at length in our September 2021 episode. If you haven't already listened to that episode, I'd encourage you to do so when you're done with this one. There's a link in the episode notes. Hampton and I met up here in Colorado Springs, one of many stops on his book tour for the Wide, Wide Sea. As usual, we had a fun and at times very funny conversation about history, his research and writing process, and all things Captain Cook. We started out talking about why Hampton is drawn to write about controversial historical figures, and we talked at length about how he combined historical accounts from Europeans with those from the indigenous cultures that Cook visited. We talked about the mystery of Cook's dramatic personality change, how Cook's arrival disrupted the equilibrium of Polynesian cultures, Cook's leadership style both before and after his personality change, how Hampton organizes such a massive amount of research, and how and why he works so hard to get his books into the world. He also gives a sneak peek into his next book, which will be based here in Colorado and explores one of the West's most notorious massacres. A huge thanks to Hampton for taking time out of his busy schedule to chat with me, and thank you for listening. Hope you enjoy. Hampton, once again, you nailed it with your book. I loved it. Thank you. I'm glad we got to do this in person. You're looking good for having been on the road. You're a road warrior right now. How you feeling?
Well, cumulatively a little bit tired, but I've done this a few times now. This is my sixth history, I guess. And so I've learned how to pace myself on book tours, and my publicist has sent me to some very nice places. And the reception of the book has been incredible. And it's as exhausting as it is, it's also energizing, to meet people, meet readers who've read it and read my other books. And so I'm holding up pretty well.
Well, that was one question. I was just thinking about the process of writing and getting it out in the world. I feel like as technology's, improved and everybody's more and more connected, people try to shortcut some of the in-person stuff and I feel like if you look at the actual process of you putting out these books, other than podcasts like this, it's pretty similar to maybe your first and second book as far as hitting these cities, going out, working. Like, what do you see? What is the important, like the upside of getting face-to-face with the readers, doing these readings versus just hitting them on the internet all day long, if you've even thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's no substitute for pressing the flesh a little bit and hearing from your readers. And sometimes you get an interesting tidbit or a tip or maybe a critique, And because of COVID, I think I was cooped up for so long, and while I was writing this book, that just getting out in the world, just reminding you that there are people all over this country who still go to bookstores and still like the old-fashioned paper, ink, glue, open up a book. There's nothing like it. I think ebooks are great, and Audible is fine, but there's no substitute for the real thing.
Yeah,
and,
I agree with you.
And not only that, but I think it works. It's like communication coming full circle. You've read the book, they come out to see you, they tell you what they like and didn't like about the book. I don't know. It's a more complicated, more interesting form of communication.
Well, we connected. The only one of these things we've done virtually was, I guess it was during COVID, and it was your The Exotic, which was kind of a portion of this book, and it was awesome, and I loved it. And we hit on a little bit of this, but I'd love, for people who didn't listen to that episode, I'd love to talk about why Captain Cook, because I think most people have at least heard of Captain Cook, have some idea that goes along with him. He can be a very controversial guy in a lot of ways, get more and more controversial as society has become that way. But what was the moment when you were like, all right, I think there's a book here?
Mm-hmm. Well, I do think the fact that Captain Cook has recently become controversial makes him more interesting and it starts to answer the question of why now. All over Polynesia, all over the Pacific, there's been this reassessment going on, just as there has all over the world, really, about colonialism, imperialism, these great heroic explorers. Maybe they weren't so heroic. And Captain Cook is at the center of a lot of this because he was one of the very first, if not the first, to stumble upon all these islands in the Pacific. And so Polynesians are, reassessing, and his monuments are coming down and being splattered with paint. And there's one in Vancouver that was just hacked off at his ankles, and, I get it. And I in a sense, I get it because he was the sharp edge of the colonial sword. But really, in fact, for the most part, he was an explorer. He was arguably one of the greatest explorers of all time. And certainly also, in addition to that, an absolutely fastidious, methodical, and, one of the greatest map makers of his of his century, if not of all centuries, considering the tools he had to work with. All of which explains why he's resented so much, because he would go on these voyages, he would have these encounters, and he would go back home and he would make these maps that showed all of Europe exactly where these islands were. These islands that had lived in more or less, splendid isolation for centuries, if not millennia, are suddenly found again, and they are thus accelerating this whole colonial process. It's like, okay, here comes the whalers and the fur hunters, the sealers, the armies and the navies and the alcohol and the money, and finally the missionaries come and try to rewire these whole societies. So it's not so much what Cook did, it's really what came immediately after Cook because of his voyages. Mm-hmm. He set in motion something that a lot of people all over the Pacific resent. I get that. So I think why part of it is why cook, why now is that, if you want to understand globalism, if you want to understand sort of the global economy, if you want to understand how modernity came to these very far-flung places, you have to go back to the beginning, which is in so many of these places, Cook and his 3 voyages around the world.
Well, one of the things I've always loved about your work, I remember the first book I ever read of yours was Blood and Thunder, and you bring all these historical characters to light. And I think I've told you this before, but I feel like a lot of your books, all the characters are so bright and interesting, and you really dig. And it's almost like you combine these little biographies to tell the story of history. And I mean, I took, I think I made a 5 on the AP history exam, but I'd never liked it. And the way you highlight these people and their personalities and bring them to life, I love. And so Captain Cook, super interesting dude. But there was a bit of a turning point on this 3rd voyage. But I was wondering if you could describe Captain Cook pre-1776. What was his personality? What was his reputation before he headed off on this 3rd voyage?
Okay. Well, by the time this 3rd voyage is about to begin, he has become a huge celebrity in England and really all around Europe as a great explorer, someone who was a great captain, someone who was quite fair with his own men and quite sympathetic observer of the indigenous people that he encountered, someone who'd been around the world twice, someone who was a great map maker and a kind of a creature of the Enlightenment and the Enlightenment ethos of like, yes, okay, we're working in the service of empire, but we're also interested in the spread of knowledge in a more objective sense, meaning describing new plants and animals and bringing back relics from these cultures to be studied and publishing everything that you find for a general audience. So it was kind of a rare period when the European powers weren't exactly at war with each other, and there were a handful of other Enlightenment era explorers. Probably the most famous other one was a guy named Bougainville, a French explorer who was kind of Cook's direct rival in France. But this was this period, and he would get scientists to come on board his vessels, and there was one very famous one named Joseph Banks, Sir Joseph Banks, who was a botanist. And so in addition to just coming ashore to replenish his ships and do some exploration, his scientists were identifying new plants and animals. We get our first view of a kangaroo, for example, on the first voyage. And a lot of other things emerged from these early voyages. The first use of the word taboo in the English language comes from that. Tattooing, which, Cook's men are fascinated with. They get tattooed themselves, and pretty soon it becomes like required. If you're a nautical guy, if you're a sailor, you have to be tattooed, right? This all comes from Cook's early voyages. What else? Just all kinds of observations of Polynesian culture that we now associate with Cook. So he's in London. He's now being shown around the highest circles of society. He's joining the Royal Society, which is a kind of an intellectual fraternity. He's considered, and this is a guy who came from nothing. He came from poverty in Yorkshire and worked his way up through the Merchant Marine and then the Royal Navy, really by virtue of his own intellect, his own competence, and just a ferocious work ethic, which is another thing I love about him. So many of the officers in the Royal Navy got there by connections, by money, by luck. Yeah. He got there just by, incredible competence, and especially his map making abilities and his expertise in astronomy, all of which he more or less taught himself, which is pretty cool. So that's Cook at the beginning of 1776, kind of riding high. He's been around the world twice. He's brought his men home. Not a single man has died of scurvy on any of his expeditions. He's ready to retire and live this cushy life and write his books and be a kind of a public intellectual, perhaps an advisor to the Navy. He was well on his way to being an admiral, and he would have been knighted. But then he gets wind of this other assignment, this other expedition to go back out to do a great exploration, and he gets a little jealous. He's getting a little restless. A lot of these guys, as bad as the ship conditions are on these long voyages, first thing they want to do as soon as they get home is get back out there
Go
again.
back. And then he's like 46 at this point?
I think he's 46. He turns 47, I think, just as the voyage is about to go. He's a little past his expiration date for something like this. These voyages, 47 doesn't sound old, but these voyages took a lot out of these guys. And, he had also, he had a wife and young children and had every reason to want to get to know them finally, and was offered this job at Greenwich, and kind of cushy. But he's like, and so this kind of gets into the question of why did he go back out there?
Yep. That was the next one on my list. You peeking over here?
Hubris, perhaps. He's a very modest man, a Yorkshire guy, very dour and staid and straight and, modest in almost every way. But he was also incredibly ambitious. He said, I want to go farther than any man has, as far as it is possible for man to go. And so he got a little jealous when he heard about this expedition to go around the world, to go up to the Bering Strait and look for the Northwest Passage over Canada, but to look for it from a way that had never been done before, which is from the Pacific side, from basically go up to Alaska, a place that no one really knew about except some of the Russians. So there's a couple of Russian expeditions. So he's like, I'll do that. He raises his hand. He somehow works his way to captain this voyage. And of course, we know in hindsight now, although they say third time's the charm, in this case, third time was not the charm. Things do not go well for him, particularly when he finally gets to the big island of Hawaii.
Yeah. Two things. One, well, first of all, can you talk about the boat? Because, 1776, obviously big year for a lot of reasons. He comes in, limps in after his second voyage. As he's deciding he wants to go on the third, they're like, all right, we'll get your boat fixed up for you. And then that was kind of the start of what became third time not being a charm, even just the way the boat was prepared. Can you talk a bit about that? Yeah.
So his ship was called the Resolution. And I love the way the British always named their ships back then, just with great names. The names of his ships were the Endeavour, the Resolution, the Adventure, and the Discovery. They all went on to become like the names of space shuttles or, Land Rovers. But anyway, the Resolution was pretty beat up from that second voyage around the world. And meanwhile, war seems to be breaking out in the colonies, and the shipwrights at the Deptford shipyards are supposed to be fixing up the Resolution, caulking it, really refurbishing it top to bottom. But they're preoccupied with the events that are going on around Boston, and they're outfitting all kinds of other ships to go put down this revolt. And so the ship is not getting the attention it deserves. And when Cook finally leaves in July of 1776, it's amazing when you think about it. They left July 12th. They don't know about this Declaration of Independence that's just been signed. It will take another, month or two before knowledge of it arrives. And Cook and his men spend the entire voyage in perfect ignorance of these developments. They don't know that there's a true revolution now, a revolutionary war going on for all the 4 years of the voyage. And yet they're going over to the backside of North America, the same continent, but many thousand miles away from Boston, to do some serious exploring. It's kind of interesting. But so the Resolution is a tired ship being captained by a very tired captain. Cook doesn't fully realize how tired he is and how depleted he is from the first two voyages. As soon as they leave Plymouth, they start to realize that it's leaking like a sieve that had not been properly caulked. Many of the parts of the ship are rotten. And this becomes a constant theme of like repairing the ship, and perhaps repairing the captain too, because he's got some medical issues. He's got some mental issues. He's not the same guy. Something is wrong with him. And the officers who've traveled with him before are asking these questions like, what is it? Is it mental? Is it spiritual? Is it a physical malady? And historians as well have asked these questions and tried to figure out what it is. His judgment is not what it used to be. He has a ferocious temper. He's depressed a lot of the time. He's alone in his cabin a lot. People have speculated that today we might diagnose his issue as bipolar disorder because of the highs and lows and the kind of weird, erratic judgment that he exhibits especially towards indigenous people that he encounters. He had always been very composed when he came ashore and met new people, and very slow to anger. And by the third voyage, you start to see this other side. He's very cruel, both to his own men and to the Polynesians that perhaps steal a little thing here or a little thing there, and he just loses it and escalates. And these are episodes that seem to get worse and worse over the duration of the voyage, and ultimately play a very important role in his death in Hawaii.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. I think there's that one part, I think the first time when the crew is like, man, something's different about this guy. When they approach that island at night and they go and there's a reef with breaking waves and everything. And that was just so at odds with the way he had acted, on the previous two voyages and just in life in general. I think I don't think it was in the book. I think I saw an interview with you talking about this where you said he was a cyborg, before me, just kind of no emotion. There was a part in the book where you said that one of the things that gave him respect among his men was not what he did, but almost what he didn't do. His calmness, his lack of emotion, and then all of a sudden he's acting crazy. Mm-hmm. Yeah, quite a story about how But I wonder about the bipolar thing, because you would think there would have been signs of that before, which makes you wonder if it was some sort of. I mean, what do you think if you had to say what it was? Just kind of a storm of.
I think it's a whole bunch of things. I think, he's a lot older now, and he's a lot older than the other people on his ship. He's not like an equal. In the first voyage, there were a lot of people kind of his same age. So there's a certain loneliness that comes with command inevitably, but he's an older guy who's supposed to have all the answers, and he's beginning to, of course, believe his celebrity and believe that, he really is master and commander in every sense of the word. So there's that part of it. I think he's also grown a little jaded by the kind of the whole certain of the kind of protocols and the rituals of exploration. Yeah. For example, we're going ashore and we're going to claim this land for England. Well, they did that a lot on the first and second voyage. By the third voyage, Cook is giving the junior officers that responsibility, because he's starting to see how absurd it is. Like, here we are in New Zealand, and we're going to claim this land for our country, which is 10,000 miles away, or however far it is, and we're going to do it with the consent of the natives. Yeah, I don't know. He's rolling his eyes, I think, at a lot of this stuff. He had some physical issues for sure. One of them was sciatica. He was in excruciating pain a lot of the time, and sciatica is an incredibly debilitating thing. It's a nerve that gets, I guess, pinched from your hip to all the way, can go all the way down to your feet. And he eventually undergoes a massage treatment, a very intense one in Tahiti that cures him of his sciatica. But that's one issue. Another thing is people have speculated he had some really serious bowel troubles on his second voyage, and people thought he had a parasite. He ate all kinds of weird food. Oh, yeah. And probably, this parasite could have been depleting certain important vitamins that led to some mental issues. And then last but not least, I think he was beginning to see on this third voyage, certainly by his third voyage, the effects of these voyages on the people that he was visiting, especially like the New Zealanders. He writes about it really poignantly, like they're different. Yeah. They have European diseases now. They're obsessed with metal and money, and the way they trade is different. And there's this kind of a different attitude about the arrival of these ships. And so as he's starting to see that these voyages are not necessarily good for the people, either the sailors or the people the sailors are visiting. So kind of a existential crisis that I feel like he may be going through a little bit.
Well, it's interesting because he seems to be the kind of guy that in a lot of ways doesn't have emotion. He's, a quote, you hear this term, man of action, not much self-reflection. But then he has these moments of pretty deep clarity about, like, for example, what their presence on these people has done. And I think talking about our earlier conversation from a year or two ago about Mai, and he's kind of everything that, I think you said he's like his story is an allegory of what European influence did to a lot of those folks. And that was one thing that I kept thinking about throughout the entire part of your book, where they're in the South Pacific, they're making first contact or second, third contact with these groups who have been living in this sort of equilibrium for a long time, and they show up and they have red feathers, and it just makes everybody crazy. And it's just, I mean, I wonder if did you think much about that, just about us as humans, we humans, and how we're kind of primed up to want to be greedy or want to be envious of other people? Because it seemed, I mean, obviously their cultures were not perfect, but it seemed like they had a pretty good thing going. And then all of a sudden they're putting locks on their doors and they're building safes when all this junk shows up. I mean, how do you think about that as far as how they turned from kind of almost like this, it was a society that seemed to work, into pretty greedy pretty quickly. Yeah.
Well, I mean, these were thriving civilizations and had it kind of figured out, had a certain equilibrium, and figured out how to survive, not only survive, but thrive for a long, long time. And then here comes just a handful of voyages and a handful of ideas and a handful of objects. And you begin to realize that they're fairly fragile societies. And generally speaking, unless you were extremely rich, like a king or a priest or a chief descended from one of the, chiefly lineages, the idea of property was communal. People shared everything. They lived in open air huts, and there were no doors, there were no locks, there were no objects, really, physical objects that you needed much other than a canoe. Everything was shared. And so here comes this idea of private property and things, tools, metal, this amazing thing called iron that changed everything for the Tahitians. Let's talk about the Tahitians. Yeah. They had seen it on British ships and then French ships and Spanish ships. They couldn't get enough of it. It was just not only a tool that was kind of exotic to them or a substance, but it was something that could be used practically for any number of things, fish hooks and scraping tools and cutting tools, and they just couldn't get enough of it. And so when Cook's ships arrived by the third voyage, people are going underneath the ship and swimming underneath the hull and prying loose the nails. And the ship is starting to fall apart, and Cook is getting genuinely worried that they would just dismember the ships because they needed to get at that metal. And also the sexual stuff. I mean, in the early voyages, there had been a lot of sexual encounters between the Polynesian women and the British, but a lot of it was pretty innocent and just curious, and a lot of people actually genuinely seemed to fall in love with these women. But by the third voyage, it sort of has descended into this kind of tawdry trade, a sexual encounter for a nail,
Yeah.
And it literally came down to that, a nail. So it's Cook is seeing all of this, and he's pretty jaded by it. He's worried about it all the time. He's also very worried that his men are spreading venereal disease, which they are all through this voyage. And he doesn't really quite know what to do about it. He tries to prevent his men from going ashore, but it's just, when you anchor after being at sea for many months, the men are going to go ashore, or the women are going to come on board the ship, which they also did. And so there's a lot of sex in this book.
There is. I've got this copy here that I'm going to give to my parents, man. Yeah. Come on.
I mean, I don't get, I had to dial it back a lot. I mean, I'm a kind of more traditional historian, and most of my books, I don't think there's any descriptions of sex in any of my books before this, but it is just rampant, especially in the South Seas. And of course, famously, the sailors, a lot of them signed on for this voyage because they had heard about it. And they're like 16, 17, 18 years old. And, they really wanted to be on the voyage primarily so they could get to Tahiti and see for themselves what this was all about.
And speaking of these beautiful places, you went and visited a good number of them. I think in our last conversation we had, you told the story of having to bail out of there as COVID was coming down. But I know that travel and actually seeing these places, and even going to England and meeting, different people that are connected to Captain Cook's legacy, seeing the documents for yourself. How important is that to you as a historian to actually feet on the ground, touch the documents, that kind of thing, versus, the high-tech stuff we were talking about earlier?
Yeah, it's enormously important for me. I know there are historians who can just sit in a room and just work off of documents, and that's good enough for them. But I wanted to go to these places not only because, of course, many of them are absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, better than North Korea.
Right. And also because they're very different island to island. There's little subtle differences as you go through Polynesia that I wanted to pick up on. And so that's part of it. Also, it just gives you so much more confidence when you're writing a passage and you're describing, let's say, the South Island of New Zealand, where a certain number of chapters are set in a place called Queen Charlotte Sound, where Cook had stopped many times. And, you just, describing the lay of the land and the bugs and the birds and this different sounds and the feel and the atmospherics, it comes across in lots of subtle ways when you're writing those scenes. And however, this book involved more travel than any of my other books, maybe all my books combined, because Cook went to so many places. There's no way I could have gone to all of them. I just couldn't have afforded it. I had to kind of pick and choose. But I mean, he goes almost to Antarctica on the third voyage, to a place called Kerguelen Islands, and he goes all the way deep into the Arctic, in Alaska. So he's going from almost the South Pole to the North Pole, from the realm of penguins to the realm of polar bears. And this is just one of his 3 voyages.
It's really crazy to get your head around when you just think about it, and you paint such a picture of what was involved in it.
And that they made it back. I mean, most of these voyages during this age of exploration, I mean, often they would run aground. Someone, a ship would sink, capsize. Or they just drop like flies from scurvy. It's amazing when you think they went out, they did all this voyaging, they went over 100,000 nautical miles, and then they came back. They made it back.
Well, and that was a fun fact in there that I didn't know, but that Cook was one of the first guys to figure out how to prevent scurvy. He didn't fully know how he was preventing it, but he had figured out a way to keep it at bay. And and everybody was just amazed by that.
They thought he had conquered scurvy briefly there, and he did have a regimen that had within it the secret, but he didn't know what the secret was. And it was that he required his men, whenever they came to an island or a continent, to hunt for fresh fruit, fresh meat, fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, anything fresh. Get off the tried and true salt diet of, of pork and hardtack biscuits and so forth, and, get fresh food. And in that fresh food was vitamin C, although he didn't know about vitamin C. And his men died of other illnesses, just like all these voyages. They're incredibly dangerous, and there's all kinds of pathogens, but they did not die of scurvy. And so the people in the Admiralty back in London thought, you've conquered this horrible disease, which was not only was it a terrible way to die, your body just kind of disintegrates from within, but it had killed millions of European sailors, and it was kind of viewed as a occupational hazard for any long-distance voyages that was generally tolerated by the European powers up until that point. It's like, well, we've got to extend the reach of the crown. We got to fight for resources and go claim lands, and we'll just so half of our sailors will die.
Yeah, and it would. I mean, half was not out of the question a lot of times,
right? And they didn't know why. Was it hygiene? Was it something in the air? There was all kinds of crazy theories about it. No one understood at all about vitamin C until actually not really until the 1930s was the exact the compound or whatever. The chemist elucidated what it was, and it was this thing that we now call vitamin C. Of course, it wasn't long really after Cook that the British started introducing limes and lemons and citrus. They understood something about that worked, but they had no idea that it was this thing called vitamin C.
What was the biggest unexpected discovery you made personally as a historian going through this whole process of writing? Because, I mean, obviously you had an idea of what you were getting into. It was of great interest. You know, as a historian, you knew enough about Captain Cook. But were there any big kind of surprises that came to you through this writing process?
Well, one of the things that I realized pretty early on, I mean, I guess I thought first this would be a real focus on Captain Cook himself and almost a biography of Cook. But I started to realize what a huge thing these voyages were, and all these other officers who came aboard the ships, wanted to travel with him, were great writers, some of them really great writers. And I began to realize this is really an ensemble story. It's not, I mean, Captain Cook was a decent writer. He was a clear writer, but he's also writing for the Admiralty, and he's not really free to say what he thinks and feels, and he doesn't really have a tendency to do that anyway. He's a real sober-minded person. So I guess it was surprising to me how much I gravitated towards these other voices. And there's a guy named Samwell, and there's a guy named Rickman, and there's a guy named Ledyard, and you begin to triangulate all of these different journals and logs with what Cook is saying, and you get this three-dimensional account that is so much more interesting. So I guess to answer your question, it was surprising to me how much literature there was to work with, primary documents. I mean, I think there were like 40 different journals of 40 different characters that I'm constantly quoting in addition to Cook. And some of them have been published, some of them have not. Many of them were accounts that were not authorized by the Admiralty, which kind of makes them more interesting.
Yeah, that's the good stuff.
And I fell in love with some of these characters, particularly this guy Samwell. It was a Welshman who I probably quote more than any other single person. And so that's part of it. And then the other part of it is it wasn't exactly a surprise. It was just a little bit harder to locate this material, which was using oral history of indigenous people whenever possible and weaving that into the story, because up till fairly recently, it seemed like everything that's ever been written about Cook is from his perspective and not from the indigenous point of view. And a lot of scholars have gone out and found this stuff. A lot of anthropologists have either located stuff or gone back out into the field and found stuff. So I try to use as much of that stuff as possible, and I think you get some surprising results.
One of the things I really loved about the book is that you make it clear. It's in a lot of ways, in some ways, it reminded me of Kit Carson, how there are these just extreme views on both ends of the spectrum about both the details of his life, but then the impact of his life. And I feel like you very clearly present both sides and let the reader know that this is a very complicated guy with a complicated legacy, but you show just how extreme it is. And I was wondering, like, now that the book is done and out in the world, were there any parts where you felt like you needed to take, you had a firm historical opinion about X issue with Captain Cook, and you were going to take that stand, and it might make some of these people mad? I mean, is there anything like that could possibly some of these scholars get a little flustered with?
Yeah. I mean, I guess my take on Cook is right down the middle. I do think that he was one of the greatest explorers of all time. Yeah. And I use the word great by what do I mean by great? Just by so many different metrics, like the number of miles he traveled, the risks that he took, but somehow got his men home. The fact that no one died of scurvy on any of his expeditions. The quality of his observations, the quality of the writing and the science and anthropological knowledge that he brought back. Every metric you can think of, he is in the pantheon, right up there with maybe Magellan, Marco Polo, Alexander von Humboldt. I mean, there's, he without question, one of the greatest explorers of all time. And you can't take that away from him. Right. However, the impact of his voyages is a very complicated thing. And that's the part of his legacy that's being questioned. And I think what I end up saying to my Polynesian friends is, in some ways you're picking the wrong guy. He was the messenger of modernity. He's bringing the world to you. this other world, the European world. It's really what came after him that should be questioned and reassessed. And of course, these fragile island cultures were devastated, and I get it completely. But it wasn't Cook's fault. It's just that he's become a symbol, and because the English like to erect a lot of statues all over Australia, New Zealand especially, and elsewhere in Polynesia. And, it's easier. You can't erect a statue to a movement. You have to pick a guy, and they usually pick Cook. Yeah. So that's why he's so controversial, I think.
Well, and I feel like when you're laying out kind of in the first few pages, if I remember correctly, you talk about how he was pretty enlightened for the age he was in, and he would even name, when he had an indigenous name and he knew it, he would put that on the map sometimes.
Yeah.
Versus just naming it after all his buddies. And I thought that was, he was definitely enlightened for the time,
for his times, for sure. And I think the other thing that one of the arguments against Cook is that, well, he shouldn't have come. He shouldn't have gone out there. He shouldn't have wandered the world. He shouldn't have wondered what was out there. And yet, we all know that that's just deeply embedded in human nature. This is what we do. It's everything good and bad about us is that curiosity of like, what's over the next mountain range? What's over the next horizon? And of all the people in the world who understand that and should understand that, the Polynesians who had populated all of the Pacific and who were some of the greatest long-distance voyagers of all time, they should get that. All these islands were the product of great voyaging and great migrations that had taken place a long, long time ago. And I always like to imagine a scenario where, what if the Polynesians, who are these great wayfarers, what if they had come to England first?
Yeah.
And, imagine they show up at Plymouth. What would happen then? Like, would the English kill them all, or think they were aliens, or, in these, coming in these beautiful, great canoes? It would have been an interesting hypothetical to think about, because it could have happened.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to spoil, I think the actual ending people know, but
well, they know. I think Captain Cook, if he's known for anything among Americans, it's that he died a very violent death on the Big Island, but they don't know how, and they don't know the escalating miscues and miscommunications that led, kind of like a Greek tragedy, to this ending, this outcome.
It just seems like the odds of things lining up as they did to create that, end result for Captain Cook. Could you talk a little bit about even the way they came in circling the island and what that meant? Yeah.
So Captain Cook, just completely dumb luck, decided to circumnavigate the big island of Hawaii, and then anchored at this place called Kealakekua Bay. And Kealakekua Bay is the place where there's a temple to this god Lono, where they would sacrifice people, and where there just happened to be this festival going on called the Makahiki. And Cook arrived at the height of the festival in a way that there was an ancient legend that Lono, who had sailed off the edge of the world long, long time ago, would come back. And he would come back with the land always at his right, which meaning circumnavigating an island in a counterclockwise fashion. That's exactly what Cook did. That he would come in two or three giant ships, giant canoes with huge sails like Cook's ships, and that he would arrive during the Makahiki at this exact place, Kealakekua Bay, which is a beautiful, beautiful place. And so he arrives, and there's anthropologists have endlessly argued about whether the Hawaiians really thought he was a god, or the god Lono, or whether he was just some other kind of supernatural being. But they bow down to him. They call him Lono. They bring him into the temple. He's the central figure in this elaborate ceremony. This is a greeting like none he's ever experienced before in all of his travels, because it seems they're worshiping him as a god. And he kind of goes along with it. He doesn't exactly, maybe at the very first, he's like, come on, no, settle down. Nice. You don't have to bow down to me. But after a while, he's like, this was pretty good. So they seem to have thought he was a god or at least a very powerful man for the first some number of weeks, and they have a wonderful time, and they get all the food they can eat, and the women are beautiful, and the climate is great, and this wonderful festival is still going on. But then a series of events take place, which I won't talk about, but let's just say that they decide he isn't a god, if they ever thought he was, and then they get really annoyed with him and his men, and things escalate very quickly, and then they unravel very quickly.
Yes, they really do. There's a part in there where you were mentioning the kind of scholarly debate about whether or not they thought he was a god or not, and I love the term you said. It was a esoteric smackdown
between two anthropologists, one from the University of Chicago, one from Princeton. They hated each other. They fought each other, almost literally got into fistfights at conferences and things. And so I talk about that a bit in the book.
Well, and that's another thing, just as a historian, one of the things I love about your books is you put little bits of humor in there, and it's not, not over the top. Some people might not even know, but this subtle humor. Like I remember there was a part where when one of Cook's men got killed, and you said he added to his long list of jobs a new one, homicide detective.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't just one of his men; it was 10 of his men.
Oh yeah,
had been. Something had happened in New Zealand with the Māori warriors, and they had been attacked, these 10 men, and overwhelmed and killed. And then because cannibalism was a thing in Maori culture, when you're supposed to imbibe the spirit of your enemy, all 10 of these men had been eaten. And Cook had to go back some 4 years after the incident to find out what had happened, to see who was responsible, and maybe were his men at fault for this. He didn't seem to care about the cannibalism part. He's like, once you're dead, well, who cares if you get eaten? But he ended up deciding that his own men were at fault, that they had brought this on by prematurely using a musket, and which brings up an amazing quality about Cook. I mean, he was very kind of agnostic and objective about, and he probably would have been a great homicide detective.
Yeah.
He was like, get the facts. He's almost like Columbo in that passage. I mean, he's just like getting the facts, writing them down. Okay, I think my men are, they were at fault, and I'm not going to get mad at the Maori, and I'm going to forgive them for their, okay, so they ate my men. Big deal.
But then, interestingly, I think it was the same part you talk about. It highlights the just completely different operating systems of Polynesians and Europeans. And I think it was that part, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Polynesians lost respect for him because he didn't want to avenge the deaths. It was almost like it was expected if somebody did something bad to you, you had to do something bad back. And it was almost by having restraint, it was a bad leadership quality. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I mean the Polynesians, the Maori, seemed to think that. They expected that Cook would avenge these 10 deaths in a very violent way, and at least, kill 10 of their men and the ringleaders behind the attack. And that's what they assumed why Cook had come back all these years. It was 4 years later. They've assumed he had come for retribution. And he hadn't. He basically just wanted to find out what had happened. And he decided that it was his own men's fault. And so this position that he takes, the Polynesians can't believe it. And they don't, as you say, he lost respect in their eyes. And his own men also couldn't believe it. It was like, why aren't we going to war against the Maori now? And he took this very measured position right down the middle. And so it's actually a turning point in the book, though. I think after that, you don't see him being so sober-minded, and he becomes much more quick to use violence against the indigenous people that he encounters along the way.
A question about your process. The amount of information out there, like I remember at the end, you're talking about when they published the account of the book in England and it sells out. It was very expensive. It sells out, but it was like 1,600 pages. And then I just started thinking about all the information you had to process, and you do such a great job of inserting quotes, into paragraphs, just kind of the perfect quote at the perfect time. And this may be a boring question to people listening, but I want to know, how do you organize all those quotes? I mean, like how do you organize that information to be, because I would imagine it's just so much to be at the ready. Like, I can go here to find a quote about this and plug it in. I mean, how did you do that?
What I do is it takes a really long time to organize. Let's just say we're in Tasmania, which is one of the chapters. I'll get the Tasmania materials together. I'll see what did Rickman say? What did Samwell say? What did Clark say? Get all the what I would consider to be the best observations and quotes together in one document, kind of like organizing your paints, all on one palette, so it's all close at hand. And then I'll probably use the Cook journal as kind of the main journal that I'm following the action. And I don't know, I mark up a lot of these things. That my library looks really impressive, like it could be valuable someday, until you open up the pages and every page is all marked, scrawled up. It's probably worthless. It will be a worthless library. But I think it probably takes me longer to organize and assemble the stuff than it does to actually write the chapter. It was like, let's say the Tasmania chapter probably took me a couple of weeks to write it, but probably took me over a month to organize all the stuff, assemble it so that it's close at hand, so that you can grab that quote at just the right place.
I always read the acknowledgments of books because I'm always just interested in all the people that played a role in it. And you offer great praise to your editor. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could talk about what he adds to the mix, because you're an editor. That has been a big part of your career for a long time. What do you get from how does he help you out?
Well, my editor, Bill Thomas at Doubleday, he's been my editor ever since Ghost Soldiers, way back. That's awesome. I think part of it is that he knows me really well and knows my style. And he doesn't, at this point, line by line, I don't feel like I need much of an editor. I edit myself a lot. My wife is an editor too. And, by the time I turn in something to Bill, it's pretty clean line by line. But strategically, he's brilliant. He's like, there's a problem here. This isn't working. You need to be mindful of the fact, like the sex stuff, for example. I had dialed it back a lot already, but he was like, still, this is too much. People, you're going to get in trouble. Dial it back even further. He's very judicious about that sort of thing. But he also saw a way to make, for example, the prologue and the epilogue. There's this kind of mythic language that I use in the prologue, really, to describe what the Hawaiians thought when these two ships arrived. And that had been embedded deep in the book. And he said, pull that out and use that as a kind of a set piece, because it's beautiful writing and it's kind of mythic. It feels like a legend or something. And it's a different voice from the rest of the book. And so bookend it with both a prologue and an epilogue, and that, using that language. So that was one of his many ideas. It's great. It's great to have a great editor. A lot of times people resent their editor somehow. They think, I could write a great book if it wasn't for my editor cutting out all my good stuff. But Bill's not one of those. He's light touch kind of editor. But whenever he makes a strategic decision, it's usually the right one.
Yeah. I loved thinking about that. I'll tell you later about it, but I'm working on trying to do a little writing project myself. Oh, yeah. And I've completely defer to the editor and then argue with them that it's probably not good enough, that maybe they're wrong.
Yeah.
So I think it's fair to say the whole writing thing has worked out for you. It's going to work out. But one thing I really respect and admire about you, and we first met just before you had started the tour for On Desperate Ground. And so I got to kind of see that. And now you're in the depths of the tour for this book. And I feel like you work. I mean, it was such a long process to write this book, but you're working so damn hard. And, by any standard, you've found the success. Can you talk a bit about the process of actually selling the book? Because I think I talk to a lot of authors and a lot of people, and then I hear from a lot of people that want to be authors. And some people just think, I'm just interested in the art. I'm just interested in the work, and then we'll see what happens. Whereas you work very, very hard after you're done writing. This is like a whole new job. How do you think about these book tours, the actual selling of the book?
Well, I guess I worked this hard on writing the book. I want people to buy the book, and I want people to read the book, and I care about the reviews. And it's like the more you're invested in a project, the more you want to see some sort of result. It's my livelihood too. I mean, there are gentlemen writers out there who could care less, and they just do it for pure pleasure, and I get that. And that's great, but this is how I pay my bills, So there's that. The other thing is that in order to do the kind of books I like to do, you really need a big advance, because you need to travel and you need to sit down with archives for years. And so when you have a big advance that you need to pay back, in a sense, the publisher needs to earn back the advance before you can ever see a dollar of royalties. I don't know. The stakes are just bigger. Everything about the project is bigger. Bigger advance, a longer gestation time, more research, more travel. And so by the time the book comes out, you feel an obligation both to yourself and to your publisher to get the word out there in the world. And luckily, I have a publicist who believes in that and knows what they're doing. But the expectation is I'm supposed to go on a book tour, and they're fairly exhausting things, and they're fun at times, but cumulatively they're very tiring. But it's great to get the word out, not only in this country, but this is a uniquely international kind of book, sure. And it's a very English-centric book. I have a British publisher as well, Penguin UK, and Australia, New Zealand, Canada, all over the world. People are gravitating to this book. I mean, it seems to be doing real well. So it's not just selling the book in the U.S., it's selling it all over the world, which is exciting, but also just kind of exhausting to think about.
Yeah, I mean, when we initially set this up and I looked on your website and saw the number of dates that you have, I mean, it's no joke.
Yeah.
But I mean, it just seems to be going so great, and the reviews are awesome. And I mean, in the days of the internet, it's hard to find stuff that you can always find somebody chirping off with negative stuff, but I've just only seen great positive stuff about this book. And ultimately, I don't care, because I thoroughly enjoyed it.
The reviews are great. It's been selling great. There is something, this is a little bit easier book to sell than some, because I just think people are primed for, like, okay, it's a nautical tale. It's a voyage about a captain. Okay, Captain Cook, I've heard of him. I know a little bit about him, although I can't tell you how many people have said, you must be writing about Captain Hook, right? The pirate from, and I'm like, no. First of all, he was fictitious. That's Peter Pan. But also, Captain Cook did not have a little weird appendage with a hook on it or a parrot on his shoulder. And he wasn't a pirate.
An alligator with a clock in his stomach.
Yeah. But no, people seem to have just enough information already to understand what the book is. And there is a huge readership out there of people who love these nautical tales of woe where things do not go well, whether it's Shackleton or, David Grant's book, The Wager was a big hit. And a lot of, people seem to love, especially when English people get in trouble, and these vintage nautical tales. And this is certainly in that tradition.
Yeah, it's awesome. I love it. This may not be the right time to ask you this, but what are you thinking about a year from now? What are you thinking you're going to be doing? I think you need to come back to Colorado College and teach.
I've thought about, I am coming back to Colorado. I have a new book I'm under contract I'm working on that is very much in keeping with mountains and prairie.
Oh, all right.
And it is a book. It's basically about Colorado territory during the Civil War.
Oh, cool.
It's kind of like Blood and Thunder moved north about 300 miles.
Nice.
It has some major characters running through it, but it's about the gold rush and the founding of Denver and just the mass of miners who came here and in the early 1860s. And it's about the Civil War and the Civil War battles that happened. It's about Chivington, and it's about the Sand Creek Massacre.
Oh, wow.
And all of these developments, but there's a main character running through it who's a guy named Silas Soule. I don't know if you've heard of him.
I've heard the name, but
he's the main guy who refused Chivington's orders and refused to participate in the Sand Creek Massacre, and then testified against Chivington and really gave the story, the true story of what had happened there, this atrocity, but then ultimately was murdered in downtown Denver by one of Chivington's supporters. So he kind of gave his life to telling the truth. And he was 26 years old when he died. Wow. And he already had this amazing life. He'd been part of living in Kansas, working with John Brown and all these abolitionists, and had freed slaves north on the Underground Railroad. And I don't know, a lot of other things that he did in his very short life. So that's what I'm doing next.
All right.
I've been nautical for a while. I'm going terrestrial, and I'm going to be in your backyard for the next 3-4 years.
All right, then we'll get another podcast on the books. Hampton, you're the man. I was saying before we started recording, you and Ann have just been so kind to me and just encouraging. I remember when we first met at the Aspen Institute.
Yeah,
I didn't know why I was there. I was like, I don't know what I'm doing, blah, blah, blah. And you were so complimentary, and it meant a ton. I was like, all right, he's got no reason to say that nice stuff. I better take this thing seriously. And it's been awesome. So,
well, you're amazing. And you really do have a gift for people and conversation, and both the gift of the gab, but also getting, burrowing down into issues and important topics. So keep at it, man. Your podcast is awesome.
Thank you so much. Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number three, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number four, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.